Hi everyone, thank you again for registering for the LHSS webinar on strengthening planning and budgeting at the subnational level. If you were at the webinar or you listened to the recording, you'll notice that one of our panelists had some connectivity issues. That was Helene Barroy, who is a senior public finance expert at WHO's Health, Finance and Economics Department. Ellen has kindly recorded her contribution separately, which you'll see in the recording, in which she shares her experience with Francophone countries. And she talks about how the promising practices that we presented would apply in Francophone settings. And she also shares some final reflections on the topics that were discussed during the webinar. We hope you enjoy the recording.
First of all, I think what is very important to understand is that the setting is quite different. So from what I know, in most Francophone countries, we don't speak in terms of decentralization. It's really much more focused on what is called deconcentration. The main difference is that with deconcentration, indeed, some powers are being delegated to subnational levels, but actually there is quite a lot of controls that do remain at the central level. So what I've seen is that in several countries, there is then some overlaps between the role of subnational levels, the central level, and there is often a lack of clarity on who is in charge of what, who is leading the budgeting process or processes, what about the spending processes? So some further really complexities and often lack of clarity on who is supposed to do what. So what we've heard previously regarding practice one, what has been studied through this work, I think is very relevant for Francophone countries because it could really help clarifying the roles, who is in charge of what, strengthening potentially some capacities at subnational levels, but really starting from explaining what should do what at each level from a budgeting and spending process. Also based on an observation on several countries. What I've seen in Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania very recently is that there was a perception that with decentralization or deconcentration, somehow the role or the roles of the central level is much more lighter. While I think in practice, with decentralization, with deconcentration, there is quite a lot to be done also from the central level. So it doesn't mean that this is really the end of the game for the central level. Deconcentration or decentralization to become effective requires quite a lot of work, training, strengthening capacities, clarifying again the protocol and the procedures. So last, probably something that we've observed quite recently in some Francophone countries is that they have really started to adapt and tailor their PFM systems to make them work much more better at the central level, but also at the subnational level. So there is an understanding that to make PFM systems work in the health sector and to align it with the needs of the health sector, it requires some adjustments. If we take the case of Burkina Faso, for example, they have, first of all, refined the way they formulate budgets in the health sector. So they are transitioning to program-based budget, which is not a reform that is unique to the health sector, but they really took it very seriously in the health sector, trying to define budgetary programs that are aligned with the priorities of the sector. They have also simplified spending protocols in the health sector, really trying to streamline how the money is spent from the central level up to the facilities, the PHC facilities. So now the first thing is that I think it was mentioned briefly on Nigeria, and I see it also happening in several other countries. In general, public financial management reforms lag behind decentralization processes. What we see in countries is that decentralization has been initiated, introduced, it's being implemented. Sometimes, okay, it's not fully implemented and finished, but at the same time, we see that the existing PFM rules, systems, and processes are then becoming at odds with decentralization. They are not updated, so they are disconnected somehow with the decentralization processes. The second point that I wanted to make is that, in my view, there are two specific areas where policymakers at the subnational should really focus their attention. The first one is obviously regarding budgeting. And as in many countries, and I think it was mentioned for Namibia, subnational levels are encouraged, invited to introduce program-based budgeting. It's one way to formulate budgets that would actually promote output. So you no longer formulate budgets by line items, but you group inputs and line items into broader budgetary envelopes, which are called the programs. And those programs are expected to deliver on pre-identified goals or outputs. It's really one way, if you wish, to align your resources with the priorities you define for a given sector is related to budget execution. In general, we all tend to focus on resource mobilization. I think it's also true for the subnational level. We focus on generating more resources, and historically we may be less interested in using those resources effectively, right? So there's new evidence now, and I think it was mentioned in the case study of Nigeria, there is new evidence that indeed there is a need to focus much more attention, dedicate much more attention to budget execution processes. In the health sector, it seems that there are some bottlenecks from both the health side, but also the finance side, the PFM side, that do limit our ability to fully spend the resources and the allocations that we have. So specific attention is needed to really provide an understanding of the key bottlenecks in the expenditure management chain. The last point that I wanted to make, which is very much closely related to the example of Tanzania, is that in the way decentralization or deconcentration reforms and policies have been conceptualized in the past, I think a key caveat that I see is that often we're very much centered on the role of provinces or the role of districts, but often we've forgotten that facilities and PHC facilities, to start with, do also have a role to play in those decentralization processes. They are part of the chain, right? Or they should be, right? And it's something that has often been overlooked, I think, as part of decentralization processes.